we're always dancing when the music plays. Join us now, we're on a marathon, dancing, dancing through the nights and days. We must dance because the 30s scream, the 30s scream because the horsemen ride. Orphan Annie lives, Daddy Wharf outside, Red Lion shanty towns, Frankenstein's bride. Adolf Hitler and the 6th Street Follies, Joseph Stalin and the bag full of jollies. Call your broker and buy marzipan while we keep on dancing, dancing on and on. Marathon, marathon.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape 429, February 22nd, 1980, and it's side 1. If you hear a little outside noise, it's the rain on the roof. We're getting a lot of rain and wind here, the second week of that famous California rainstorm. It isn't too bad in Carmel, but you might hear it, and I don't make the tapes at the radio station. I do them at the house if possible, so every once in a while you may hear a funny noise, and I believe it's that rain on the roof. The ABSCAM inquiry is going to get so complicated. I already have a whole filing cabinet full of various articles, important articles, and I'm trying to assimilate them and put them into cross-sections so that I can make as much sense for myself and for you at the same time as these investigations break open. If the FBI said they had 50 such operations that they were going into, these will all weave into each other, I'm sure, at various points, and I have to keep them in chronological order as they break and then get the interconnecting links of the various investigations. The ABSCAM basically is centered, again, in Florida with Representative Kelly, South Carolina with Representative Jenrette, New York with Mr. Murphy, Representative Murphy, and then congressmen from Pennsylvania, and New Jersey public officials from Pennsylvania, New Jersey. The Pennsdorf is from Alan Dorfman, that gets that title, centered in Chicago, Illinois. The Teamsters organization, Dorfman has been linked to members of organized crime and various connections that were illegal. He's been prosecuted on some of them already. And in the course of wiretapping him, they picked up conversations with Senator Howard Cannon from Nevada, and that involves certain decisions made in Senate regarding trucking and Teamsters that they're looking into. The Bry Lab covers the Beverly Hills, Arizona, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma territory and public officials, and since last week the MIPORN has opened up and they have arrested 55 people involved with pornography. This is a 2.5-year investigation which covers the area of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Cleveland, Ohio, Providence, Rhode Island, Baltimore, Houston, Honolulu, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And then there's another grand jury investigation going on now with Anthony Spilatro involving skimming money in Las Vegas that takes the money into Kansas, Milwaukee, Las Vegas, Nevada, and St. Louis, Missouri. And the allegations are being made to the grand jury that the skimming money passed through a store that Spilatro has called Gold Rush Limited, and that's in Las Vegas, Nevada. So that's a lot of investigations that do cross over with each other that aren't clearly defined at this time. And I believe that an overzealous FBI came in and got tips of information from various informers that have been named from these cities that broke stories open that are like wildfire and could get out of control. The Justice Department may deny leaking the details to the press, but all the major media, NBC and Newsday, New York Times, and all of them were informed months in advance of what was taking place, and they could break that story in order to assure that these people wouldn't have to go to trial because, in quotes, they were tried by the press. And by informing the press, you get your congressman off the hook. I don't think it'll wash, but I think that was the intent of letting the story go fast and then singling out a few quickly and close the case as soon as possible. I was so disgusted this last week, Wednesday, February the 20th, on Good Morning America. Rhoda Barrett was on there, and she mentioned that a movie was going to be made about ABSCAM, and she mentioned 3 people. One of the writers, I didn't know his name, one of the 3 people that was to write it, but the first person she mentioned was Leslie Maitland from the New York Times. Now, I wondered, Leslie Maitland carried this story, and she's the person I called about the missing photograph, the oil painting that set off the ABSCAM investigation. And I mentioned that this could go very high and be like Watergate, and that it could go all the way to the Pope and the Vatican and the Gambino family and Jimmy Carter and a lot of narcotic connections. And she seemed to know about all the connections, and she said, "Oh, I'll call you back." But little did I know that Leslie Maitland was working with Les Whitten, the associate of Jack Anderson, and that they're getting ready to make a movie. And Rhoda Barrett was saying on Good Morning America that it's going to be similar to All the President's Men. Well, Woodward and Bernstein were brought in quickly to cover up the real story of Watergate, the killing of Mary Jo Kopechne, the murder of Robert Kennedy in 1968 that made it possible for Richard Nixon to become president in 1968, and the shooting of George Wallace and the killing of J. Edgar Hoover in May of '72. The real crimes of Watergate were never investigated, or the plans to have riots and demonstrations at the time of the Republican conventions in Miami. Jack Anderson was very important in Watergate to break the story and bring down Richard Nixon, and in return we got Alexander Haig in the White House and more power for Henry Kissinger, and in came Nelson Rockefeller and a team more powerful than the Richard Nixon, Rebozo, Haldeman gang. The tentacles of the Eastern establishment really were brought in because of Watergate. And I thought that this story smacked of Watergate. Jack Anderson is the fellow who wrote about the ITT memo, and Dita Baird, and broke the story of payoffs to Richard Nixon's administration and the committee to re-elect the president, given to John Mitchell by ITT, that forced Nixon to move the convention to Miami from San Diego, that opened up a large can of worms. Well, as of this date, Jack Anderson isn't writing anything about any of these ABSCAM or Brylab or the investigations, but his associate is working with Leslie Maitland and working on a project of a movie. Here we have congressmen, public officials, the casinos in New Jersey, organized crime covers being investigated, allegedly by the Justice Department, and then we get information that the news media that's been behind breaking the story and leaking it, that would allow these people to get off on the basis they don't have a fair trial, have the nerve to make a movie. It's bad enough to sit and watch these movies on the Kennedy assassination or on the life of Howard Hughes or Patty Hearst kidnapping or the Manson family and all these bloody lies that are made in film. But the idea that they're making arrangements for a movie before a single person is arrested, it really means that our public officials, our Justice Department, our agencies are only here to entertain us. They use these people. If an informer tells about them, instead of getting them arrested, they leak it to the press, and the information the informers have goes wasted because the guilty people can get off. The links of ABSCAM should go very high. I was optimistic last week, and I mentioned it. I thought with Jeff Gerth and Howard Bloom working on the story, it would go very high. But I can see now that the contract to make the movie and to commercialize it will kill off the real investigation, and they'll settle for just a little bit of a story and think how marvelous they were to entrap a few people. I have many listeners who subscribe to my tapes and who also read New Solidarity and are always asking me to make some comments about the National Labor Party and Lyndon LaRoche Jr., who is trying to run for president of the United States every 4 years. And I keep promising to do a tape just on some of the information they publish and how I disagree with much of what they print. But an example of the kind of research they do or the selective writing they do could be brought out at this time, because they have an article, February 8th, New Solidarity, Will FBI's ABSCAM Be a New Watergate? Well, I believe it's a Watergate operation, and they believe it is a Watergate, and they refer to the fact that NBC knew 2 months before the operation what was happening, and that they were collaborating with the FBI, and that the home that the men were entrapped in belonged to a reporter of the Washington Post who temporarily went away for a while. They insinuate that this is a thoroughly dirty investigation into alleged congressional bribe-taking. Well, it can't be alleged when the men were photographed with attorneys tape recording and listening to make sure it was legal, and they're actually seen stuffing money into their pockets and making promises for immigration department to bring people in. They may have been entrapped in a way, but it isn't an alleged bribe taking, because some of them have even admitted, yes, we took it in satchels or I put it in my pocket. The New Solidarity brings out that they're trying to get Democrats. There's one Republican and the majority are Democrats. I agree with them on that. They point out that they're pretty liberal Democrats working with labor-based organizations, labor-connected politicians, urban-based machinery, fairly social conscious Democrats. I agree with that. But then they mention the men that have been implicated in this terrible scandal, and they list their names. Now, there's nothing about Representative John Murphy with his links to General Somoza. He went to West Point with Somoza and has been a lifelong friend of his. He's on the Pahlavi Foundation with the Shah of Iran. He has links to the Gambino family, organized crime. They don't bring that out, and they don't bring out the fact that Mr. Jenrette was being investigated by the FBI, Representative Jenrette, for allowing his property in South Carolina to be used for narcotics to be brought to this country. Now, they're supposed to be the experts with the book Dope Incorporated on the traffic of organized crime and narcotics to the country, and yet here are two men linked to that kind of operation that are totally ignored. And when the criminal element gets into here, and all that is coming out with the links of Carlos Marcello to the Kennedy assassination, and his favors with Mr. Noto of the Immigration Department. He was going to give Noto a full job with him. He resigned just last month from the Immigration Department, and Marcello's contacts of Noto with Senator Williams' office. That's a different story. Carlos Marcello is a multimillionaire organized crime figure that's dealt in narcotics, prostitution, crime, who was named by the House Select Committee on Assassinations as a role in the Kennedy assassination. They keep saying the Bronfmans are behind the Kennedy assassination, and yet you have Marcello linked into this ABSCAM scandal and very quietly missing from the article. The article written by Kathleen Murphy says that ABSCAM is a deliberate operation by the Trilateral Commission to rig the 1980 elections and make way for George Bush. Well, Jimmy Carter was handpicked by the Trilateral Commission. He was a graduate of Annapolis, 11 years in the Navy, commander of an atomic ship. He has Mr. Brzezinski in the saddle. He is everything the Trilateralists wanted. He's gotten all the weapons increases. He's got the army in the Persian Gulf. Jimmy Carter is a military man handpicked by David Rockefeller. Why would you Watergate Carter to put in Bush? It's true they may want a trilateralist for each department. They may want Bush, and they already have Carter. But there's no indication here that the Trilateral Commission singled out this operation or these men. The truth was that an informer in New York got stuck on an arrest charge and offered information in exchange for not going to jail. An informer got caught in Phoenix, Arizona, and offered information on the Bry Lab in Los Angeles, Texas, Southwest, in exchange for not going to jail. An informer in Miami offered information on the pornography case in exchange for not going to jail. And these little men, rather than take the rap, began to squeal, and that's why the investigations started. It wasn't that these men are members of the Trilateral Commission by a long shot. They just wanted to save their ass, and they began to give information, and the Justice Department followed it, I'm sure, not knowing how far they were going. And my last point about the article by Kathleen Murray in New Solidarity, she says, one immediate aim of ABSCAM is to usher through Congress the Carter administration's new charter for a U.S. intelligence community. The CIA and the FBI are making stricter rules. They're going to prosecute people if they give out information on the intelligence data that they have when they're working with them. They're going to open our mail. They're going to wiretap. They're going to decide who are security risks. They're going to break into homes and bug everybody. And it is true that when you get organized crime hitting about 50 states, it gives an excuse to wiretap anybody to fill in with these investigations. But I think the war that Jimmy Carter's getting us into in the Middle East, the taking of the hostages, the Afghan situation, those are the things that they are going to use as an excuse to come down on us across the country, because when you get a war, you get anti-war protesters, and that's what brought Operation Chaos and Mr. Odom from the White House and the secret team that works with the military to make martial law. In order to get away with a war, you have to take all the protesters, and those are the young people, the students, the middle class, the educated, the university faculties, and you have to get in and decide that they're a risk to the country. And it's the war that's coming along that is making the laws necessary. These investigations on the crime figures are not the factor that is going to bring tight CIA and FBI control down on our heads. So in essence, the difference I have with New Solidarity is not bringing out Carlos Marcello, not bringing out Murphy's links to these other dangerous people with a lot of power. He's not an innocent little person. He's been playing the game for a long, long time, this Representative Murphy, with the military and all the powers that be. And it's true that they may shift the New Jersey gaming casino tables, but the person who gains from that is only Resorts International. So far, they're the only group that have a permanent license in New Jersey, and they can get out the governor and the gaming commission and various people, and Resorts International will keep control. I believe that's run by the Trilateralists and the Council of Foreign Relations and the Justice Department, and they are skimming out certain people, but there are a great deal of persons who were interviewed, have been written up in the New York Times and Washington Post, who were offered money and said, hey, get away, it stinks, I don't want it. They didn't set a trap for everybody because some people recognized it was a sham and couldn't be sucked in. So these men aren't completely innocent, and they played a role, and they were seeing stuff in their pockets and briefcases, so you can't call it an alleged bribe taking when they're putting that kind of money in and putting it in their glove compartments, in their filing cabinets, and shuffling it around and not recording it as a campaign contribution. And this was too much money for contributions anyway. So the difference I have with New Solidarity, I might exemplify in other tapes that come along, because as the ABSCAM story breaks, I can show you the parts that, the dope parts too, and they stress Dope Incorporated, that they will leave out, and the links of the dopesters that were caught in this net that will get off because the media is allowing them to. That part is true, but they should be exposed for having links to these politicians who have very important jobs in Washington. I did several tapes on trying to locate the name of the painting, the oil paintings that were taken that set off this investigation, and I've told you how I called the Justice Department and the Attorney General and Howard Bloom, New York Times, and Leslie Maitland, and Howard Bloom said he would call me as soon as they got the name of the paintings that were stolen or set it off. And I called the local FBI too. Well, Howard Bloom didn't call back, and Leslie Maitland didn't call back, but the New York Times carried a story February the 14th, this last week, on the paintings, and it was reprinted in the San Francisco Chronicle. The story going that recovery of art by the FBI in 1978 was the test of the ABSCAN technique. Now, in the San Francisco Chronicle, it says that there was a art dealer who lived in Michigan who moved to New York, and he had two paintings that were stolen. One was a Rubens, and the other, he mentioned, was an artist that I really wasn't familiar with, but is fairly well known, Gerard Terborch. And coincidentally, the picture I was looking for was a Rubens, 17th century Rubens, and these paintings had been insured for $150,000. And according to the New York Times article in the Chronicle, they disappeared from Santini Brothers' van that was carrying the effects of Lawrence Fleischman. He's the director of the Kennedy Galleries in New York City, and when he moved to New York City in 1966 from Michigan, these paintings were missing. And according to FBI report, February the 17th, 1978, they got a tip from an informer that two men, a Dominique Casarelli and an Arthur Palmer, were at the airport, and that they were responsible for these paintings. And the informer made arrangements for the paintings to be put in a van, and they were returned. and the men were not prosecuted for stealing these paintings. When they went to the judge, they were formally charged March 30th, 1978, for interstate shipment, and they pleaded not guilty and went to the judge August 78, and then there was a request, a sealed affidavit made by the U.S. Attorney's Office for an adjournment for 6 months, and the U.S. Attorney said, put this off 6 months, we're not going into it now. And then January 1979, they rescheduled the trial, and then there was another motion that this be put off and did not go to trial. So these men continued to be free, and the case never went to trial. And according to the New York Times, reprinted in the San Francisco Chronicle, the painting, one of them was a Rubens. I was looking for a Rubens that William Taub had missing 13 years ago when he moved. The Teamsters moved his paintings. That was the gift from the Vatican that was so important that I've mentioned on previous tapes. But the San Francisco Chronicle carried the story of the origin of the Arab sting, but they left out a part that the New York Times had, and that's why it's so important to take a lot of newspapers. I only can read 8 or 9 or 10 a day. I wish I had time for more, because the lawyer for the 2 men that were charged with taking these paintings, according to the New York Times, have said that they don't even know about those paintings, that their client didn't negotiate going off an airplane and negotiate with these paintings to sell these paintings, and that they're not involved at all. And this one lawyer said that his client was seen a few feet from a truck walking his dog, and it's never gone to trial. That Martin Siegel, that's the attorney Martin Siegel for Mr. Palmer, said that the United States attorney tried to convince us to make a guilty plea 2 or 3 days before the trial, but both men have maintained their innocence. Mr. Casarelli said he didn't even know what they were talking about. He never spoke with the FBI, and their sole connection with the case was to be near the van. So that case is still up in the air. The court case was sealed. It's not available for anybody. So I'm not really sure until we find out someday from William Taub if he ever found his Rubens. We won't be sure if he was an informer or tipster who set this thing off, that was catching certain people in the net that I call the Watergate revenge, or Taub's revenge. William Taub had relationships with the Teamsters, with Jimmy Hoffa, with Richard Nixon, the CIA, the youth organization, and after he was almost killed and left for dead in Switzerland and recovered, it may just be that he didn't come back so quietly, and what set this thing off might have been the missing Rubens 13 years ago. It's quite a coincidence that a Rubens painting is involved in both situations, and that the men who've been named as a factor that set ABSCAM off have denied they had any part of it, and all court records are locked up to this day. My very suspicious mind was concerned about the riot that took place in New Mexico, February the 2nd, and on tape 427, I briefly talked about the prison riot and the killing of the 33 prisoners there, and how unusual it was, the circumstances for those particular deaths. And I also mentioned that Raymond Precunier, now under sheriff for the San Francisco Police Department, used to be chief of prisons in California when we had all the Nazi white Aryan Brotherhood fighting racial fights in the prisons that were segregated, then allowed to mingle, and the murders in the California prisons. Precunier has been part of the CIA Central California Intelligence FBI operation all of his life, and just prior to the riots he was down in New Mexico advising them in their prison situation. Well, an interesting article came out by Matt Mygat this last week. Search for answers continues at riot-torn prison. Savagery astounds investigators. And this article goes into the fact that it was the most savage prison riot in U.S. history, 36-hour reign of terror, how an inmate was beheaded. You've heard all the gory details before. And they were asking questions how prisoners got such easy control of the system, and what turned them on and what got them out of control. The article goes on to say that the uprising took place among members of an execution squad that some inmates said roamed the prison in search of victims, many snitches and hated informers. And I mentioned before that they were out after specifically the informers. But on the eve of all these organized crime stories breaking, from pornography in Florida and the various states and cities I've mentioned, and Las Vegas and California Southwest and Midwest, New York, New Jersey, all coming together, what kind of informers were at New Mexico prison that this gang went through. Now, the article refers to them in interesting words as an execution squad, and I think of the type of people, the 130 so that have escaped from Jim Jones, that were part of a brainwashed execution squad. The article says the riot began the morning of February 2nd. That was the same day as the other stories breaking. The men were drinking home brew in a dormitory. Two unarmed guards came in. They were unarmed, and they came in to see them, and they broke into the prison control room. The men took and overpowered two guards. Now, I don't know where all the others were, the bell system or whatever, and they shattered a bulletproof glass that had been recently installed, despite warnings that it was not impenetrable. Then they took the internal locks and communications and keys to the other cells, and they went storming through. And their primary concern was the 7-man execution squad was to take blowtorches, metal rods, and axes and torture and kill fellow prisoners. They went after, with a blowtorch, the snitches, the Aryan Brotherhood, which is the Nazi group, and the Mexican Mafia. Some of the violence was directed against informers. This is coming out of New Mexico, Associated Press story. The rioters ransacked the prison offices and rifled confidential files. They said no one in prison is lower than an informer. They went on to say the inmates said they would kill the people who betray their country. Now think about that a little, because I don't know who of those 33 was there that these prisoners could get through glass, go through the filing cabinets, have a set execution squad similar to Nazi Germany, actually, and be challenging those particular informers as threatening their country. I could see where they could threaten the friend of theirs, but there had to be some political connotations here, because the quotation in the newspaper said, "You hang a guy out here for treason when they betray their country. It's the same thing in the penitentiary. They kill the people who betray their country." And they went after them, and the first targets, according to this article, appeared to be inmates in a protective dormitory and cell where they were kept for a number of reasons, including being erroneously or actually identified as informants, but others apparently were victims of personal grudges. Now, two consultants helped the Attorney General, Jeff Bingaman, investigate a mass escape that took place in December. There was a mass escape in December, and this is February. One of them was Raymond Pecunier, that's the man I mentioned before from California, who's an excellent one at setting up this kind of hostility or gang war, and the other is Robert Bork. And they said there was an ongoing training program, and the salaries they found out were inadequate. 33 inmates died, and then the article says all 33 who died during the takeover were homicide criminal cases. That doesn't mean they killed somebody, but they may have been informers on homicide criminal cases, and all 33 were killed. And a lot of informers, even if there were just 3 that would break these other stories wide open, they would be very valuable, and it would be important to wipe them out. Now the question is, Robert Bork, the same person that was involved when Richard Nixon was covering up the Watergate story. Mr. Taub says that his name, William Taub's name, is on the Richard Nixon tapes regarding Jimmy Hoffa and chicanery, which was never released, suggesting that those were the missing tapes or they were wiped out. There was a Mr. Bork, a Robert Bork, described, I have one book here, The Great Cover-Up by Barry Sussman on the Watergate team, and he describes Nixon's aides all knew, that's Haldeman and Ehrlichman, knew that Cox would not accept the offer, that was Archibald Cox, to have certain congressmen listen to the tapes and decide if they were important or not. Special prosecutor Cox wouldn't go for that. So when he refused to do that, they brought in the White House chief of staff at the time of Watergate, Alexander Haig, and he ordered the Attorney General Richardson to fire the special prosecutor Cox. And Richardson said, I'll resign first as the Attorney General, I won't do it. Then Haig, the protege of Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, who's now running the White House, graduate of West Point, ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire the chief prosecutor, Mr. Cox, and he wouldn't do it, and Mr. Ruckelshaus resigned. Then finally they called the number 3 man in the Justice Department, Solicitor General Robert Bork, who was acting Attorney General, and he fired Archibald Cox because Cox would not go for a special listening to the White House tapes, and it was the tapes that brought Nixon out of office. I think it's terribly important to find out if this Robert Bork was down at the Santa Fe prison prior to the shooting, if he was down there in December, and if there were special agents here, because, again, I've mentioned, and I'll go to on the other side, we don't have enough time on this side, to certain informers squealing now about Richard Nixon and John Mitchell, and where these informers are part of that team in that cell. This New Mexico riot was set up. Specific people were killed. All of them were killed, and they were killed just at a time when these investigations are going all over the country.
Roger, drop it open high. God makes mushrooms just as God makes time. Beats is sweeping like a lollipop, so we keep on dancing, dancing, we dance on. Marathon, 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 marathon. Bingo, Hitler and the 6th Street Folly, Joseph, Stalin and a bag full of jollies. Call your broker and buy marzipan while we keep on dancing, dancing on and on. Marathon, 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 marathon.
This is Mae Brussell, and it's side 2 of tape 429, February 22nd, 1980.
Now we're on a marathon, dancing, dancing through the nights and days.
There's a trial going on right now in Philadelphia that involves a self-confessed mob hitman, Charles Allen. Allen claims that he personally delivered $40,000 to John Mitchell as a gift from Jimmy Hoffa, who was in prison and wanted to get out of prison, and Mitchell was the Attorney General. The trial has to do with it's a racketeering trial of Francis J. Sheeran, president of the Teamsters Local in Wilmington, Delaware. And Allen has been spieling about killing 5 or 6 people for the Watergate defendants, for the White House team for that were all removed from office at the time that Nixon was cleaned out. And he's mentioned in the trial that he was paid by Sheeran to commit murder and arson and other crimes for them. And the same day that one of these stories came out was February the 12th, this last week. Hoffa's aide suggests a payoff to John Mitchell, and it goes in some more into the payoff to Mitchell. Right below it, it says U.S. probes underworld tentacles in Las Vegas, which I mentioned earlier, the casino skim money having to do with Kansas City, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Las Vegas skimming money. And then the John Mitchell story that has been carrying on quite a while, this fellow's been breaking it, is right there along with the underworld story. Now, this man is a hitman who says he's done murders for the Watergate defendants, and I'm sure he didn't do them alone, and it would be very interesting to know all 33 of the informers that were in the Santa Fe, New Mexico jail that were purposely slain to protect, in quotes, their country, because if Robert Bork was there, he worked directly with Robert Haldeman and John Ehrlichman and Richard Nixon and John Mitchell and the entire Watergate team that, again, were linked with Teamsters and William Taub and that whole ball of wax that I've been talking about for many weeks. So the New Mexico riot, where these people were so terribly mutilated and tortured and killed, and some of the people, the guards and spectators, watched outside with binoculars and didn't even come in till every single one of the people on a particular wing had been murdered. I think it is directly linked to some of the story that's breaking, but we'll have to pursue further to get the list of the names, but even the names alone wouldn't mean anything. Imagine if you had a few people like this Allen, who's testifying now, Charles Allen, if you have them on a cell, you'd eliminate all this information that keeps pouring out. And we will be updating mysterious deaths, drug-related deaths that will be pouring out, because in addition to those deaths in New Mexico, there will be many, many more. In Mountain View, in California, there was the death of a mysterious Douglas Battaglia. He moved up here near Palo Alto recently and opened up a Dynatron Components Incorporated in Mountain View. And he was with a woman from Las Vegas. His family said they didn't know her. She came from Las Vegas, and she was found stabbed cruelly 25 times, shot twice, once in the head and once in the neck. And in trying to find out the cause of this death, they found some lethal ingestion of an unknown toxic substance in the stomach of Battaglia. They're trying to say it was a murder-suicide. But again, she was from Vegas. He was in an electronics firm that had just moved up to the Bay Area from L.A. And these terrible kind of mutilation deaths could be related to the scandals breaking at this time. So it's important to save the articles and later see if there's confessions on possible links to these stories. Another man that died the very day that the story broke, his name is Michael Zaffaroni, and he's supposed to be one of the country's major traffickers in pornography. And he died the very night that the story broke about the photographs of him in the probe of the FBI investigation. He was one of the main suspects, and the night that he was to be arrested, he died of a heart attack. I hope I get time in the near future to outline or chart for you the difference in the drug traffic since the Vietnam War and when the Shah was in Iran and when the Shah left January 79, and how the narcotics increased in this country and that opium and heroin are pouring in, and how the traffic route was changed through Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Turkey. And with the Soviet Union coming down to Afghanistan, they interrupted this tremendous narcotic traffic pattern. And this is one of the reasons, this multi-billion-dollar business that's being upset. And I believe it's one of the reasons for a reaction of so many people to the venture that the Soviet Union did into Afghanistan at this time. The type of article that makes me believe that this is going on, I do have so many of them. A typical one, and one of the newest to come out, was last week in the Washington Post, Friday, February the 8th, 1980. The title of the story, the big story, is Iranian turmoil is fueling a surge of heroin here. This is in Washington, D.C., the Washington Post. The political upheaval in Iran resulted in a major increase in smuggling to Washington and to all the major cities in the United States. The end result, especially noticeable in the Washington area, is higher quality heroin for sale to addicts. The law enforcement officials attribute the recent increase in smuggling from Iran to the ease and accessibility of heroin and the ability of smugglers to leave the country. And it goes into the statistics of the overdoses in New York, 34 so far in this past year, and in the medical problems and the hospital problems, and in the arrests, the law enforcement that goes with this. And it goes into the quality of heroin that's coming in, and it says the emphasis has shifted. First it was from Southeast Asia, then the Mexican heroin, and now it's shifted from the Southeast Asia, and it seems to be coming from Iran. The increased smuggling is the Iranian heroin that was cut off this last year, the Southeast Asia, and switched to the Iran heroin that was coming through to this country. The U.S. drug enforcement have trouble with the Iranian machinery and the government, and the drug smuggling is now coming in the hands of small-time smugglers instead of the huge operations. And I mentioned before that the Shah's sister has been linked to large narcotic operations, the Shah of Iran, and the government officials. And one of the big problems in rearranging the traffic pattern is that it's now in the hands of the smaller, like the mom and pop grocery stores. The small-time smugglers are pouring this stuff in. This article says the Iranian heroin had reached England last summer, and anticipating its arrival in the United States soon, it is here now. And it goes into the big increase in, as I say, the admissions to the jails and the addicts, and the quality. They can tell by the blood test what's coming in. Now, one of the persons that they arrested in Washington, D.C., there was a big arrest, and it had to do with a man who has a restaurant in the Chevy Chase part of town called the West End Restaurant. This is from the New York Times. They arrested the man who has this restaurant. The owner is his name is Mohammed Rosham, and he went before the federal judge and asked that the bond be reduced and that he be released in the custody of two friends. And one of his friends was a former Central Intelligence Agency employee. Well, I don't believe there are formers, but it's interesting that the man that was involved in this huge narcotic operation was to be released to the custody of the CIA man. And I mentioned way back on the tapes that one of the reasons the Shah was so nicely eased out of Iran with the help of Jimmy Carter and the Central Intelligence Agency was that they would have a clear-cut narcotics traffic pattern that they could take care of. And there were several people arrested with him, two other people, but the main owner of the restaurant was to be released to the custody of an agent from the Central Intelligence Agency. Another article in the Washington Post about uncut heroin, 7 pounds from Iran. The suspected dealers are caught, and this is from the Washington Post, February the 6th. The man who had the restaurant and who was arrested only had what the drug enforcement agency called was $32 million value. It had a street value, these 7 pounds, of $32 million. There was a down payment promised of $5 million. There was $5 million in a safe deposit at L'Enfant Plaza, a branch of the National Bank of Washington. There is a lot of money in the narcotics, and there's been a lot of money since the Shah moved out and a new group came in, and as much as anything else, there is a drug war going on. The Washington Post also goes on to say the Drug Enforcement Administration officials reported recently that their troubles were increased by the amount of drugs coming in from what they call the Golden Crescent. The Golden Crescent is Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, the global trouble spot that is also the world's largest producer of opium used to manufacture heroin. So you see, if the Soviet Union just marches into a totally illiterate, terribly devastated country like Pakistan, whose feudal system is mainly supported by keeping women down and as slaves and high illiteracy and no education or intelligence, and a few feudal lords doing their dope dealing, you can see how the Soviet Union could fracture the economy in the United States, in Harlem and Washington and St. Louis and Los Angeles and Miami and every major city in the United States and in Europe. If they cut off that drug problem drastically with the Soviet troops, you could see what this would do to a lot of people, particularly a man in Washington, D.C., who just has one simple amount, a $32 million package right there in his hands. Multiply that all over the world. I can't even begin to guess the billions of dollars in narcotic traffic that has altered since the Shah of Iran is out. I've done many tapes on Michele Sindona. He was a chief banker for the Vatican, starting with Pope Paul VI, and I won't update you on those. You can go back to earlier tapes on Sindona. He was to go to trial for his case at Franklin Bank in New York City. There was $45 million misappropriated. That's a nice word for stealing or a bank robbery. When you're very rich and you're a millionaire, you call it a misappropriation of $45 million, the defunct Franklin National Bank. Sindona was to go to trial in September and was missing for a while and then reappeared. This is the Michele Sindona that is linked to the Banca Unione in Milan, Italy, and to the Vatican. He was given a large amount of money for the Vatican to invest in the United States and all over the world, and the money is tied into the Carlo Gambino family and organized crime. So Sindona is a pretty heavy dude to be going to trial, and last week his attorney asked that he be given special privileges, Sindona, because of his influence and power in Italy. Frankel had gone to Rome, that's his attorney, Marvin E. Frankel, a lawyer for Sindona, and he went to Vatican. He spoke to the people in Rome shortly before the trial, according to the New York Times, and asked two cardinals and an archbishop to give videotape testimony as a character witness for Mr. Sindona. He wanted the Vatican to speak up for this guy who was absconding $20 million here and $30 million there, $30 million of unauthorized money, a loss in banks in Italy, and the Vatican is out about $90 million, and they wanted a character witness in the terms of legal people, two cardinals and an archbishop, and the Vatican refused. The Vatican Secretary of State ruled out that it would set a bad precedent for them to testify on behalf of Mr. Sindona, even though he was a financier who had wealth and power, described in the New York Times, and had been the financial advisor to both Italian politicians and the Vatican. The Vatican reneged on sending people to give character statements, videotapes for Mr. Sindona. And furthermore, at the time that the story was breaking of the links of Senator Murphy in New York and his contacts with the Gambino family, and earlier the story of Mr. Sindona from the Vatican with his links to the Carlo Gambino family, just at the time that the one story was breaking, the story of ABSCAM and Congressman Murphy and his possible links to the Carlo Gambino family, Mr. Sindona was slapped into jail. He's been out on a $3 million bail all this time, even though he had disappeared for a while, and he came back. And the New York Times said there was no announced reason for revoking the bail, but it had something to do with his disappearance, and they thought maybe he secretly had traveled out of the country. Maybe he had gone to the Vatican, and they slapped him into jail, which is where he is right now, while the other ABSCAM and other drug-related, politician-related, congressional-related incidences are breaking. Sindona, who is very political, who has links to the crime, to the organized crime, to the Vatican, to Nixon, to the committee to re-elect the president, to John Mitchell, the whole ball of wax. The very time that all these stories are breaking, they took Sindona and slapped him off the streets and put him in the clinker, and that's where, as I say, he is at this time. I've done many tapes on Jimmy Carter and the links to organized crime and the narcotic connections. I'll have to total them all up in one big tape or 2 or 3 tapes sometime instead of a little bit each week. But there are continuous links of him to the drug connections, and they could be the explanation of why at the time he allowed the Shah of Iran to be removed, because it did open up a whole new narcotics market, and people that have put Jimmy Carter into power may be appreciating some of the profits, such as that gentleman that has the restaurant in Washington, D.C. I don't know how many links there are, but they just come up over and over again. Jimmy Carter appointed Cecil Andrus to become Secretary of the Interior. He used to be governor of Idaho. When he first was governor in Idaho, he appointed a Sheriff John Bender to be head of the law enforcement, and people are outraged at the selection of Bender, and LEAA said you couldn't have him. And there was mention then at the time that Andrus took money from a mob-connected racetrack cartel, and there were a lot of questions about organized crime in Idaho, and the FBI was to do checks on Andrus, and they were also looking into the appointment of Bender as a sheriff there in Idaho. This is similar to Raymond Percunier being deputy sheriff in San Francisco, with high important links to tentacles of government and intelligence throughout this state and nationally. Well, Jack Anderson's article, February the 15th, 1980, he tells how the files of Bender's appointment were locked up, the investigative file, but when they got into them later, it contained serious allegations about Andrus himself, that he had taken campaign contributions from organized crime figures, probably through the Emprise Corporation. Well, when you hear the name Emprise, it should ring 1,000 bells. It's like seeing Rosebud on Citizen Kane's sled. Emprise is a national organization that was named by reporter Don Bowles at the time his car was blown up and he was murdered. Just before he died, he said Emprise got him. They're noted crime figures from the Northwest and Canada and Phoenix and New Mexico, the Southwest, all around the country. Emprise is a large, well-known group of mobsters, and in the files of Mr. Andrus, who's now our Secretary of the Interior, was information about donations and contributions from organized crime, and that's the man that Jimmy Carter appointed to a cabinet position. For the remaining part of this tape, I'm going to be talking about Jonestown and Colonia Dignidad in Chile, a new article by Charles Krause in the Washington Post on Colonia Dignidad. But alongside that is another article, Washington Post, February the 13th. This past week, California's Asian communities are seething with crime. Well, there are many people from Vietnam who have brought in millions of dollars, 3 million here, 4 million there, 20 million here, 40 million. And I know this for a fact personally through people who are familiar with these agents. They're buying hotels in the Bahamas, they're well, I don't want to reveal any secrets. There was somebody in the area here that was going to buy a large piece of land and a compound, a person from Vietnam, that brought over a lot of money. I understand Premier Key from Vietnam came over with $40 million in gold. The Vietnamese members of the Central Intelligence Agency that were allowed to fly out, part of the Phoenix program, the terror program, left with millions of dollars. And now the links of organized crime and drug and narcotics traffic have increased tremendously. This article in the Washington Post goes into a lot of the opium connections and the Thai connections and the California Asian communities that are seething with the influx of these people into the California area bringing drugs from Southeast Asia. Not, again, the Marseille connections, but coming right up into California with their contacts. And I think that's important in terms of bringing Asians to this country. Who is getting out? Which ones are getting out? The anti-Castro Cuban community that was into narcotics, prostitution, child prostitution, and syndicate and mob in Cuba were kicked out with Batista, and when Fidel Castro came in, the worst elements of Cuba came into the United States and formed the anti-Castro Cubans that set up so much violence and bombing and terrorism in the United States and our literal army for the Central Intelligence Agency. The White Russians that left the Soviet Union when it became the Soviet Union, the Tsarists, the Solidarists, the Vaslov's army, brought assassination techniques, torture, massacre, counterintelligence, terrorism, agents provocateurs, brought all that to the French and taught it to them and taught it to the Germans and formed the armies of Adolf Hitler after the revolution. We get a certain percentage in this country of the not so desirables who were kicked out of their own country because they were cruel and corrupt, and just like our early founding fathers were men let out of prison. If they came to this country, they'd let them out of England. So we have elements here that are the degenerate aristocracy of their particular places, and when you get the Asians and you get the Cubans and you get the White Russian elements and the Nazis, and you bring all these people into this country, you get a boiling pot of corruption and crime and mass murders and terrorism. And what we're feeling now are pockets of these people coming into this country, and they also have raided their territories with all the gold and counterfeiting and treasures that they can take when they leave. New article in the paper this week: Jonestown may be settled with refugees from Laos, 750 primitive Laotian tribesmen and 750 refugees from Dominica, from the Caribbean island. The son of Billy Graham, Franklin Graham, wants to bring into Guyana, with Prime Minister Burnham's administration, $2 to $6 million project to bring in persons with their airfare from Thailand to Guyana to take over Jonestown. Now, this one article in the Los Angeles Times describes that these people worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. They fought against the Laotian communists. They got support from the CIA, and now they're being brought to Guyana. Mr. Jagan was removed, and he was a socialist or even maybe a communist, and he was in charge of the government in Guyana, and Burnham was put in by the Central Intelligence Agency. So now the religious groups want to bring over Laotians and members of the Phoenix program and the intelligence program into Guyana, and then within 5 years, the article says, they become citizens and they can take over all the politics of Guyana or the native population and be very useful with their Phoenix-type operation to control the politics of Guyana. One of the few countries that is wobbly, that isn't a total dictatorship, but the present administration was put in by the CIA. Burnham was supposed to have elections this year and canceled the elections, and now he'll get millions of dollars to come in on a 25-year basis. They'll lease the land, and it will be part of 4 Christian relief agencies, bringing in specific people that work with the Central Intelligence Agency that they're now going to get ready to move in to Jonestown. President Carter was photographed in the Washington Post last April 25th, 1979, almost a little less than a year ago. His eyes closed, and he was standing next to Elie Wiesel, a man that had been at Auschwitz and survived the concentration camps. And the Washington Post has a story under the picture in large letters. It said, "The world knew and kept silent, a memorial to the Holocaust forgotten by the unforgetting. And the article tells how the President and Congress set aside a memorial because they said that people should not forget what happened in the past, that a lot of people were helped in London, Moscow, and Washington, but not the Jews, and the truth is that they were forgotten. The world knew and kept silent. This article says that the world knew what was going on in the concentration camps, and that the lesson of the Holocaust should be to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust by being outraged and promising to banish all human oppression from the world. Now that's a nice goal, to banish oppression, and Jimmy Carter tells how he grieved when he was in Israel and saw books row after row with names of people that were murdered, and he said, in quotes, "I vowed then, as people all over the world are doing this week, to reaffirm our unshakable commitment that such an event will never recur on this earth again." A perfect example of knowing and keeping silent was Jimmy Carter's Central Intelligence Agency, FBI, and State Department that knew that over 900 to 1,200 people were going to die in Jonestown or were dying, and they waited 3 or 4 days till the bodies were decomposed and not recognized to come in, and Carter stayed aloof, and they have not investigated it, and the world keeps silent about Jonestown, tries to keep silent, and when you take 10 or 20 people that are killed, or 30 or 40, and then you go to the 900s or 1200s, the next is the 20,000s, the 30,000s, and then it gets into the millions. Charles Kraus has a long article and a map on Colonia Dignidad, located in Chile, bordering to Argentina, outside of a town called Parel, 200 miles below Santiago in Chile. I first learned about Colonia Dignidad in Ladislaus Farrago's book Aftermath, and I've mentioned it many, many times on the tapes pertaining to different stories of Nazis and Nazi money that came out of Germany, and seclusion and protection in South America, and also in Colonia Dignidad. The magazine Counterspy, an article December 78, but it was written before the Jonestown came down. Jonestown happened in November of 78, and the article was printed, so it was written 1 or 2 months before Jonestown, and maybe the author, Conrad E., didn't even know there was a Jonestown, because there was no connection between what was written in Counterspy with what was written in Farrago's book. And Amnesty International had a report on Colonia Dignidad in 1975. I have a copy of it here, and I'll give you an address of where you can order it. But evidently, that wasn't written up in Counterspy, or the details of the torture and what was going on in Chile. The connections certainly weren't being made to Jonestown, because everything at that time was supposed to be ideally hunky-dory, and a lot of agricultural community development for people who couldn't stand the streets of the cities of the United States, or involved with drugs and arrests or poverty, and this was going to be the home and haven for most of these black people run by white people, and there wasn't much known about Jonestown at the time. I did the tapes in April of 1979 on Colonia Dignidad. There's tape 385, 386, 387, comparing Jonestown to Colonia Dignidad. And then later I did a story on the tapes for you of Jack Anderson's talking about Operation Condor, assassination teams coming out of Chile, Colonia Dignidad. The Condor three-part operation involved assassins and assassination teams. And of course, Jim Jones had programmed these people with signed confessions that they were assassins. And the House Foreign Relations Committee has admitted there's about 150 assassins out loose from Jonestown. And the Operation Condor takes place at this agricultural farm in Chile. Also, a recent article on Nazi organization down there. Jack Anderson had another article, and I've referred to it several times. And also on a tape, 379, a book, Treason for My Daily Bread. It goes into Martin Bormann and assassination teams in South America, and their links of the Nazis to the assassination of John Kennedy. Well, Just this week, this past week, Charles Kraus began a long story. As I said, we'll just barely get into it on this tape, and I'll promise to do more next week, and you might get the Washington Post and photocopy it if you can. And he describes this colony. He went down there last December, and he met people in town in San Diego, and one of the men in San Diego said that when I read about Jim Jones in Jonestown, I thought immediately of Colonia Dignidad in San Diego. That's what a diplomat told Charles Kraus. Now, Kraus did a book and articles on Jonestown. He was sent down there by the Washington Post right after the deaths. He was the fellow that was on the plane with Mark Lane going down to Jonestown, and he did write a great deal about Jonestown. And it's interesting that in that 1 year after Jonestown in 1978, November, December of 78, that he went down to Colonia Dignidad in 1979, December, and he's writing the story now, a few months later, and he went to the border of Colonia Dignidad. They took his film away and confiscated it, and there's no way he could get in. It's an isolated, private place that you cannot get on the grounds or speak to anybody, and the people can't leave there. On the tapes that I did, 3 tapes, I compared Jonestown to Colonia Dignidad, and I want to go over some of the points of his article here. One important thing that he mentions, there's a section here about a man who left Germany and went to Canada and Indiana, which is again where Jim Jones came from Indiana. His family went to Jonestown, his sister-in-law, his wife's sister, and the husband, and then they had 5 children. One branch of the family went to Canada and Indiana, and the other one went down to Colonia Dignidad in Chile. And he claims that this Paul Schaefer, who was in the Nazi Germany Air Force, started organizing for the Chilean community called Colonia Dignidad in West Germany in 1952. 1952 was the year that Evita Peron died prematurely, and according to Farrago, released out of 4 banks the multi-million-dollar investment that the Nazis had put away to resurge and rebuild the Fourth Reich. There isn't enough time on this tape. I wanted to update you on some of those other stories, and I did want to spend a lot of time on this Nazi commune and the Chilean military junta and the congregation of Nazis down there and torture that's going on constantly in Chile at the present time. When we talk about human rights and the president is running again for re-election, he should be approached on the matter of Colonia Dignidad. I think it's important for all of us that we expose what is going there and their links to Jonestown. Every presidential candidate and every member of Congress should be provided with information. As Charles Kraus says in the article, the lead story, Colonia Dignidad, nobody comes and nobody goes, and he's been down there and he describes it as a concentration camp. Our time is out again. This is Mae Brussell. I'm sorry the tape is so short. I wish we could do more. We'll be back together next week. Take care of yourselves, and I'll be with you next week.